Now executed. We need to go in and execute 7 workload script files on the database that we're going to turn on tracing for them as they're running. All the workload scripts will run under the trace service. Your goal is to analyze the generated files to interpret what happened in the 7 cases. From your terminal session, we're going to run our first trace file, which is called runtrace p0.shush. And the script is used to trigger the generation of statistics for the trace service. We just need to have some load going through trace service before it shows up as a service that we can monitor. Okay, and then what we're going to do, as soon as you start the execution of this file, we can move to the next step, leave it running while we're starting to go and have a look at the trace service. So we need to start this, so we need to do this from a terminal session. So I'm just going to grab the script file. I'm in the right directory now, put it in the paste buffer. And it's a shush file, so it will log in and do it, and they show you here what they're actually doing as they're running it. So they're just setting the identifier to trace 0, and then they do some SQL statements. So it runs on for a little bit, but they didn't show the whole file. So we'll get him started up, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so that was a list of files in this directory. I'm just executing one of them. So our trace 0.shush to get our first trace running. Get that started, then we'll go back to the manual and scroll down and see what we need to. So leave it running basically. Now we need to go back to the consumer pages, to the trace session, and wait until trace session shows up as one of our sessions. And then we're going to select it and enable tracing on it. It's just an easy way to enable tracing on it and leave it tracing just for that session. Then any SQL we run that is connecting to that session to the database will be traced for us. So back to Enterprise Manager, refresh it. Sometimes it takes a few minutes for it to show up as the active session. Sometimes we have to have a little patience with it. Let it run for a few moments, refresh it, and hope we didn't miss it. So it's still running. Give it a few more minutes. Okay, we're just waiting for it to show up as the top trace session. And takes Enterprise Manager a few moments to recognize it, because the load's got to start running, and then we have an agent that monitors every now and again, so it takes it a few minutes to note it. This is being refreshed every 15 seconds, so I don't have to be an A-type and keep pressing refresh. It will automatically refresh it every now and again. But we'll give it a few more minutes and moments and see if it shows up. And then I get tired of waiting for it. I look for it. And now the trace session shows up. It now becomes with the session, the background processes, it becomes the important one. Select it, okay? Watch you don't grab it between the refresh and enable tracing. It will ask you how you want to enable it, and we should confirm what they want on it. They want the defaults, which is wait events, but no bind variables. Okay, so we're back to the browser, hit OK. Now it should show that tracing is enabled, which it does. It says true. The other 2 services says tracing is set to false. So we've enabled tracing as they asked us. Okay, in here. So it should say successfully implemented, and we saw it on the screen. We also confirmed it a second way by looking under the tracing column to make sure it was enabled. Now what we're going to do is wait for the first run to complete, and then we can execute this one. So we go back to our terminal session. It's completed while we were setting up the tracing. I've got a command prompt back. Now I just paste it in, execute it, and then it becomes just a matter of a waiting game for it to execute the group of queries in here that are going to exercise the system. And then we've got tracing turned on, so we'll be able to look at how these particular queries are performing on the system as we're executing by looking at the trace files later. And this one takes a few moments. In anticipation, it will finish sometime in the future. I just scroll down. They show you all the things and the practices that this one is doing. It's doing a group of queries that return a significant amount of data, and then eventually it finishes. We don't show everything. And then we want to run trace P2. So it's sort of a recurring theme with this lesson. So we'll go back and wait for it to complete. And when it's completed, we'll run the next one. And it's completed the second one we were running. Now we're going to launch the next one, which is P2. It's done 0, 1, so we have 2 of them done. Next one, launch it off. It's doing some SQL for us. It will take a few moments for this to run. It's running on a open cursor as part of the DBMS underscore SQL package that allows you to see the individual steps. We're going to talk about this practice during this package, DBMS underscore SQL, in a later lesson when we're talking about the optimizer. And in anticipation of it finishing sometime in the near future, I'm just going to scroll down, have a look at what it's doing a little bit. It will show you the start of it. Doesn't show you everything. And then we have a P3 to run. There's actually the fourth script because they start at 0. And we'll load that up in the paste buffer in anticipation that it will finish shortly, and then we can get the next one running efficiently. So P2 finished. Now we're going to execute the next one, which is P3. Let it rip. It's creating some indexes and done some updates. Now we're going to do some things, drop some indexes to demo something. Now we should have went ahead and did the next one. This one's a pretty fast one, so we need to go get the next script file. Scroll down to the pages and find P4. Okay. And load that up and get it up and running because we completed the previous. It was a pretty quick one. Some of them are a little longer than other ones. Run P4. This is doing a block to do a PLSQL block, to do an anonymous block to do a PLSQL, okay, just to show that you can trace them also. Trace your application. Even though the SQL is buried in PLSQL, we can still turn on tracing and look at meaningful results from it. And that one completed. So we're working our way. We just completed 4. We need to go find 5. Once again, you can look at what they're doing as they're running. They show you for some of them, all of them. Some of them are a subset of them. And we'll need to run the next one, P5. Get it started off. It's doing some inserts. Inserting into sales 2 as a select from sales and union it with another copy. So it takes a few moments to do these. And while it's doing that, we can watch it run, and we can also go and prepare the next script file. The ones I prepare ahead, it's slow at getting to. The ones I don't, it's really fast. So in anticipation, it will eventually complete. So we've done a group of inserts, committed them, and then we logged into the trace user. Okay, and now we're doing some more. So once again, to put a load on the system using our trace service with the trace user that we set with that little @ setup. The AT stands for application test. It completed that one. Now we need to queue up the next one. Number 6, the one I went and got. We'll get it up and running. It's going on and turning on tracing, setting the trace identifier, then putting itself asleep for a while with the DBMS lock sleep command. And it will wake up in 30 seconds and do some other work. So we're just demonstrating demonstrating something in the trace file. While we're sleeping, we can go and look for the next one we need to run. So the next one is P7. So we're getting towards the end of these. And when this is complete, we can get the next one is completed when I can hit return and I get the next, I get another prompt back. We'll execute P7. Takes only a few moments to do this. So some are faster, some are a little slower, depending on what they were testing in it. Whoops. No, it's still doing its thing, put itself back to sleep for a while. So we'll leave it doing its thing while we look at the next step in the practice. So that runs for a little bit. Then what we need to do is go back to Cloud Control and select the services with the aggregation enabled and disable the SQL tracing on it. Okay, so we're just going to disable tracing for that service. Okay, and then after we do that, we're going to go look for the trace file. But before we can do that, we got to let this script file complete. 6 finished. Well, I guess 6 was still running in the background. And it also completed 7. So we've got them all done now. Okay, so now we need to go and turn off tracing on our session. So back to here, we had turned it on. Now we're just going to disable tracing on our session. Now we've turned it back off. We should make sure they exit, the last one exited out, so we're out of SQL+, that's good. And now what we want to do is the operating system go find our trace files. They're in a deeply embedded subdirectory under the Oracle home. And instead of us finding them, usually the DBAs will do it on a production system for, we have a little script file that will go find the ones we actually produced. This is just to go and show them that we got a group of script files out there. So we have a group of them. Some of them end in trace, some of them end in TRM. Okay, and we have a group of files out there. Now what we need to do is prepare these files. So there's a group of them we're going to merge together using trace session. So if you're curious what this does, you can just do a more on it. I'll show you that quickly. I'll just grab the file name. Whoops, see if I can. Not the execute part of it, and we'll just have a quick look at it. What they're doing this, they're just running trace session and grabbing all the trace files, okay, out of the trace session for the service of trace server. We're using that service to connect to it. Find all the SQL that was run by anything and put into any trace file that's for the trace service as a service name. Okay, and just put it into one output file called mytrace.trc. Okay, so we're going to execute that. It was just a way of canning up the execution of the trace service. Run it at the operating system level. Whoops, I needed to do the previous one first. Don't know how I got the wrong one. Not doing things in the right order. Execute this one. Takes a few moments to root through those files and create the one output file. And next thing we want to do is run tkprof. Once again, we get a little shush file that will run it. It's mildly interesting to have a look at the file first before we execute it. So he bailed out of its execution when I pasted it in accidentally. So have a look at what it does. What it does is just cd to the application trace directory, just to make sure we're in it now. And then it runs tkprof against the trace file. Okay, and it calls the output. Takes one trace file and formats it an output file. In this case, we didn't do any options on it. In my opinion, it might have been helpful to do a copy of it without the recursive calls. You end up with a lot of recursive calls in here. But you can still do the practice the way they suggest because they use search commands to find particular SQL statements they're looking for. So they're just going through and running it against the trace file. We'll execute this. And that will give us one of the trace files we're going to have a look at. The other one we're going to run tk-prof to see a slightly different version of it. And then we'll be looking at both of them as part of the process. But first, we'll have to produce them. Okay. Takes it a few minutes to translate it because it is a relatively big trace file. And then we're going to run tk-prof against one of them, the very last one, mytrace7. Okay. Now, once again, I can cut and paste this, but I have to be careful because this wrapped onto 2 lines, and it has to be one continuous line, but there has to be a space between the end of the star mytrace p7.trc and the beginning of my report, because there are 2 different parameters. They need to be separated. So you have to be a little careful if you cut and paste like I do, if you're actually doing this yourself in the future. So cut and paste it in, put the space in, and then get the rest of it. So we're explaining it from our trace account we created as part of their setup. And we're just explaining this one. Once again, adding sys equals no, I think, is generally useful for trace files, but they chose not to do it here. Paste the rest of this in on the end of it. Hit enter. Takes a moment for it to do it, and it created the trace file for us. Okay. After we've created the trace files, okay, we've now put cases 1 to 10. The first case up to step 10 goes into myreport.txt, and what we want you to do is have a look at it.